All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Bridge Elections FAQ. We're going to get started in just a moment while we are waiting for folks to join. Lauren, what was the most fun thing you did this weekend?
Oh, geez, it was a pretty relaxing weekend, but I got to hang out with a few of my friends. Got a good picture of me with one of my best friend's babies for the first time. The other pictures have been her crying, so this one was real nice.
How old's the baby?
She's only a few months old. I think she's 4 months now.
Gotcha. Nice. That's super exciting. Simon, I know you were at the conventions over the weekend, so we'll save your weekend plans for the actual Bridge Elections FAQ. Hey, everyone, we'll get started in just a moment. We're just setting some stuff up. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat, and we'll get started in just a moment. Mike, did you do anything fun?
I spent the past week in a what's called a mushroom house in Charlevoix, Michigan, a thatch roofed house, famous architect up there. It was a wonderful week, and it turned out we were the last people to rent it because they had sold the house, and a lot of people who rented after us had their plans canceled. So we were very lucky. Charlevoix is a wonderful town.
That's awesome. That's really good. You got in right at the last minute. All right, let's get started. Welcome to Bridge Elections FAQ, a live discussion where we answer your questions about the 2024 election. I'm Isabel Lohman, the education reporter at Bridge, Michigan, and I'll moderate today's discussion. We're really happy to have you here, and today we have Capitol reporters Lauren Gibbons and Simon Schuster, and data reporter Mike Wilkinson here to answer your questions. We're going to talk about a lot of things. We've got the Michigan leaders at the Democratic National Convention, a pro-Israel super PAC donating a lot of money to U.S. Representative Shri Thanedar, and we'll talk about what the Goshen Battery Plant program is and why there's so much controversy around it. We will also answer your live questions. You can just drop them in the chat and we will get to them. If you missed part of this, you can watch the full recap at our website, bridgemi.com. Thank you so much for being here. Let's get started with the first question about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He dropped his campaign on Friday. How does this change things in Michigan?
Well, for Democrats, they could say that they were excited because it looked in some previous polls that he was kind of taking votes away from Joe Biden when he was the nominee. Now that the nominee is Kamala Harris, the pattern has changed a little bit. Harris is up by some polls, 2 points in Michigan. If you throw Kennedy in the race, it's still 2 points. But I think the Trump people had always looked at him as being a potential spoiler. There was a New York Times Post poll earlier in the year where Kennedy was getting a remarkable 26% of the vote in Michigan. And once, again, Biden drops out and the race became more clear, that support really diminished, but it was still looked upon as going to be, for Trump, mostly as kind of a spoiler. And Kennedy decided he didn't want to be a spoiler. But what's most interesting is he doesn't want to be on the ballot. But he's going to be on the ballot because under Michigan election law, he has to stay there. Now, he has intimated that he might go to court to try to challenge to get his name off the ballot, but he's running under the Natural Law Party's banner, and they're not happy. They will not help him get his name off the ballot because for them to stay on the ballot going forward, they have to get a certain percentage of all votes. And with his name, they're almost guaranteed to get the 1%, or I think it's around 1%. So they're not going to help him. And the chairman of that party told me this morning in an email that it would hurt the party and hurt them if he was able to win that challenge, if he does do it, and try to get himself removed.
That's super fascinating. So it's not just about if a voter chooses to vote for him. It's actually if he stays on the ballot, how that impacts the Natural Law Party moving forward.
Yeah. And Natural Law Party was one of a number of parties that in 2016 took off, nearly 200,000 votes, and Trump won by 10,000. And a lot of people have argued, probably pretty persuasively, that if all those candidates weren't there, many of those votes would have gone to Clinton. She only lost by 10,540, I think the number is. So they have played an outsized role going back to 1980 and other elections, the Ross Perot, the Kennedy years. So, but that's not the only ballot news. There's the Democrats are not happy, probably, because Cornel West's challenge to get to stay on the ballot, which was once thrown off, is now back on. And he's an African-American academic and socialist, and they're afraid, probably, that he would take some of their votes. So you win some and you lose some.
Right. And if you want to see any of these updates, you can go to our website, bridgemi.com, where we have an elections tracker and we keep track of all of these different developments. Simon, your weekend was spent at a convention. Both state parties had their state conventions this weekend. Any surprises?
Yeah, I had a nice 12-hour day at the Michigan's Republican Party nominating convention this weekend, but Democrats also had their convention coming right off the Democratic National Convention. They essentially went from Chicago right back to Lansing to have this event on Saturday. And there was only one contested race at the Democratic Convention, and that was in the University of Michigan regent's race, where Sean Ryder Diggs and incumbent Denise Illidge ended up coming through with those nominations. But in the Republican Convention, there's a considerable greater degree of drama going on. You know, we're coming out of more than a year of turmoil and infighting within the party, where they're sort of trying to move past some of this past drama and present an appearance and a front of unity heading into this really important election. And it happened mostly at the election, at the convention this weekend, minus some really tense moments where actually the former chair, Kristina Karamo, who's barred by court order from holding herself out as the party chair, appeared on the convention floor. She said she had gotten an all-access credential from a Supreme Court candidate, but she wasn't allowed to be on the floor as a non-delegate, and so they asked her to leave. She essentially refused, surrounded by supporters, and police ended up actually removing her as she was trespassed from the premises. In the Supreme Court races there, we saw interesting results where Bill O'Grady won a partial year term after Matt DePerno, an election denier who's facing charges for allegedly tampering with ballot machines, withdrew to support him. And then Rep. Andrew Fink also for an 8-year term. And so this was mostly a successful convention, I'd say, for the party, but it was a long one. The Republicans used a hand count and ballot process ostensibly to avoid any sort of appearance of election fraud within their own party. And so this made this convention draw way into the evening. Well, we didn't see results in some of these races until 10 p.m.
And Kristina Karamo being escorted out, do you see that influencing the broader Michigan Republican Party at this point?
I mean, so much of this stuff is so arcane, so in the weeds, that your average voter is not paying attention to any of this drama at all. They have no idea. They haven't been following this. They have no idea what's going on in here. But for Michigan Republicans, I think that this talks to some of the underlying splits that are still, and the fissures and factions that are still really very much there within the party. But at the same time, when you look at what matters to them at the top of the ticket, and that's reelecting former President Donald Trump, they're utterly unified. There's no hint of dissent or division in that regard whatsoever.
And then there was the star-studded Democratic National Convention last week. By Bridges' count, Michigan had the most speakers of any swing state at the Democratic National Convention. When I'm going to put you on the spot, who nailed it? Who failed it?
You know, I think when you're talking about the DNC, this was largely decided in advance. Harris and Walz were the main events, but getting on the stage at all is a pretty big deal for a lot of these candidates. So Michigan candidates and elected officials did have a lot of moments that were memorable in at least in the Democratic social media zeitgeist. So you saw Sean Fain have a Trump is a scab shirt early on, or Dana Nessel came out and said you can pry her right to be married as a gay woman from her cold, dead gay hands. So a lot of moments were really talked about and recognized by the Democratic Party. You also saw a few elected officials get memed or get a little joked about. Mallory McMorrow, a state senator from Michigan, had a giant Project 2025 binder. A lot of people photoshopped that into a lot of different things. And Representative Alyssa Slotkin, who is running for U.S. Senate, she talked on Thursday, and Jon Stewart of The Daily Show, coined the term slot hive. So I'm not sure if that's a win or a lose for her, but slot hive is now in the lexicon. Also important to note, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who has been talked a lot about on the national stage, was pretty closely ahead of Vice President Harris's speech. She got a really prime speaking spot and was also kind of notable in terms of her reaction at the Democratic Party, and also just the fact that she was able to speak that closely to Vice President Harris.
Sure. Let me know if you ever see SWAT Hive on a campaign slogan or a poster. I think that'd be really, really fun. Okay, we're going to get a bit nerdy for a second. So as you all might have noticed, there were a lot of Michigan elected officials in the audience at the DNC, and many of them, as Lauren just alluded to, were able to speak at the DNC as well. Some of that stuff looks like expensive clothing. Who pays for all that stuff? What do campaign finance laws say about who pays for travel, clothes, and accommodations to things like the DNC?
Yeah, so this is kind of a complicated answer, Isabel. Obviously, it's important to note we've got a federal system here. So that means that election rules and what candidates can use and spend money on differs between state and federal levels. And at the federal level, federal candidates, their campaigns can't buy clothing for their candidates. But at the same time, they can borrow clothing. Patrons can provide a rental of some high-end wear to candidates, and provided that it's returned afterwards. On the state side, it's a little bit different. State campaigns can actually buy candidates' clothing. We saw this in 2022, where Tudor Dixon wore a blazer in a debate with Gretchen Whitmer that cost hundreds of dollars, and it had been purchased by her campaign. The thing is, these purchases have to be to further the candidate's electoral aims, and when they buy the clothing, it's owned by the campaign. So once the campaign season is over, if they want to dissolve their campaign committee, they've got to disburse, often give away to charity, this clothing. At the same time, if they don't want to necessarily disclose these purchases and how much these expensive outfits might have cost in terms of cash value, they use other accounts such as 501c4 nonprofit accounts. You might have heard of these as administrative or corporate accounts. And those are able to purchase things that help carry out the duties of elected officials, as they call them, in these social welfare accounts. But at the same time, you also can't be profligate in your spending through these 501c4s, as we've seen with Annie and Rob Bernard, for example, these two formerly highly placed state legislative officials who are in court right now on charges of profligate spending with a 501c4 that was owned by or affiliated with former House Speaker Lee Chatfield, where they bought thousands of dollars in Gucci handbags. So I don't necessarily know if, like, say, for example, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, if she used a campaign account to purchase an outfit for herself, since she's not running and term limited for governor, I don't know necessarily if she could have a campaign buy clothing for her for use in an event and use that. But these are things that are kind of untested among Michigan law. But the long and short of it is there's a lot of different ways you can go about it. And you really have to dig into these campaign finance reports to see those nuggets if you want to be able to find out who kind of spent money on this.
Gotcha. So practically speaking, is it possible for me to find, like at my local Goodwill, clothing that politicians have worn in the past? It sounds like yes.
It is true. I mean, when you look at Tudor Dixon's blazer from that debate, that was donated to a charity shop in West Michigan. And so if you had seen that report and it was still there, you could have gotten really lucky.
This is really good to know for me. So we have a link in the chat that explains how you can find out more information about donations and financial disclosures for candidates. We had one audience member ask reporters' thoughts on the decision to not allow pro-Palestinian speakers at the DNC.
Yeah, so this is one of the things, I guess you could say, a dark cloud that was hanging over this convention, especially given Michigan and its large Arab American population. Activists with the uncommitted movement in particular, who want a ceasefire for the conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, wanted a Palestinian American speaker at the DNC to highlight this issue. And they didn't get it. They said that they were in talks with the Democratic administration and Harris's campaign, but it never happened. And so at the same time, these activists are not shutting the door on relations with Vice President Harris's campaign, but it was obviously a disappointment for them. One of the spokespeople for this campaign, Abbas Alawiya, who is a Michigan resident and a former congressional staffer, spokesperson for this movement, went on NPR this past weekend, and he had said that, hey, I'm a former political staffer. I've been in politics. I understand that, for the policies that we want, we don't want a second term for President Donald Trump because the outcomes for Palestinian Americans might even be further from what they're looking to achieve. But at the same time, he really stressed that he wants Vice President Harris to start a dialogue and maintain a dialogue with these communities if he wants to have a chance for winning back some of these voters who are really discouraged, who might otherwise just stay home. And whether that's going to happen or not, I think is one of the big questions that remains in my mind as I'm covering this election moving forward, because we haven't really seen any indication one way or the other.
And that's on the national stage, but like you mentioned earlier, you were at the state Democratic Party convention. There was also a race, you touched on it lightly, about the University of Michigan regents. Can you speak a little bit about the person who was running from a pro-Palestinian standpoint and what ended up happening with that?
Yeah, so Jordan Acker, who is a University of Michigan regent, he was there on the convention floor and was confronted by some of these pro-Palestinian activists. And it was a tense moment. It was probably the only moment of conflict, of significant conflict that we saw at this convention. But it really speaks to sort of some of the tensions that are undergirding the coalition that Democrats are trying to maintain heading into this presidential election. And it speaks to the stakes. These activists are willing to meet candidates where they are and confront them, especially if they've expressed very, explicitly pro-Israel views, to sort of try to bring a measure of accountability as they see it to some of these issues.
Simon, you continue to be on the spot. I've got one more question for you. New campaign finance documents show that a fund connected to the pro-Israel group, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, also known as AIPAC, contributed heavily to U.S. Representative Shri Thanedar's campaign. What did you report?
Yeah, I think if we saw one notable sort of spending in these congressional primaries heading into August, was a super PAC appeared, and it spent mailers deriding Shri Thanedar's primary opponent, Mary Waters, and they spent more than $1 million. In fact, $2.3 million heading into the August primary, deriding her, and implicitly at the same time, in turn, supporting Thanedar. Now, this was a pop-up super PAC. It was a dark money organization. It meant that we didn't know who was behind the organization or who their donors were heading into the election. Now that we've had a campaign finance campaign finance disclosure post-election, we see now that this was an organization, this front, Blue Wave Action, as it was called, was actually run by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And this is an organization, they're the leading interest group for pro-Israel interests in U.S. elections. And they've been active in Michigan elections before, getting involved in primaries in the 2022 cycle. And it is an important example, in my opinion, of what we see in some of these races where outside spending can come in and really sort of make a difference. When Shri Thanedar has had primary opponents before in 2022, AIPAC attacked him for his previous criticism of Israel and supported his opponent. But we've seen this shift now where Rep. Thanedar has become pro-Israel and really supports the country, and now he's receiving the support for this organization.
Gotcha. Thank you for answering so many different questions about this. If you have more questions about how the war is impacting the election, you can throw it in the chat right now and we will get to it. Lauren, another heated issue on the campaign trail right now is Goshen. You drove last week to Big Rapids, where tensions are high between community members who disagree on whether an electric vehicle battery plant propped up by millions in state incentives should be allowed to be built. What's going on?
Yeah, so Goshen is sort of at the epicenter of a lot of different issues that are coming up, particularly in the U.S. Senate race, but the Michigan Republican Party and also former President Donald Trump has started to make it an issue as well. So the crux of the matter is this Goshen plant was proposed and is in the planning stages by Goshen Inc., which is an American subsidiary of a Chinese-owned company that has ties to the Chinese government that a lot of critics have been concerned about. The other issue at play here is business incentives, which is a kind of controversial economic development strategy aimed at getting large-scale companies to Michigan to, create jobs. Especially in terms of Goshen, Acosta County is not necessarily a hop-in industry area. So there are a lot of supporters of this were really excited about the idea of getting some of these higher paying jobs to Acosta County in northern Michigan. But a lot of the concern about it was that Michigan gave Goshen a lot of money to do so, a lot of incentives, both in getting the site prepared for the project, and also a promise of future tax breaks. So this is something that has come up in previous election cycles. Certainly, former gubernatorial candidate Tudor Dixon brought it up quite a bit in 2022. But now we're looking at this and Chinese influence generally becoming an issue in the U.S. Senate race, where Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slotkin, both very experienced in national security issues, are each claiming that their opponent has concerning ties to China. Whether that's something that takes off among voters or is something that's motivating, that remains to be seen.
I mean, it doesn't feel like that long ago politicians from both parties were courting Chinese businesses before because they produce jobs. Lauren, can you speak to sort of the shifting nature of why this is such a hot topic at this point?
I think a lot of the concern is, at the federal level, especially, is the idea of the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party gaining influence with Americans in American government. The opportunity, potentially, some national security officials or former officials have warned there's an opportunity for espionage, potentially monitoring American interests. And then the other thing, too, is that a lot of these international corporations have started to sniff around because the federal government, through the Inflation Reduction Act, offered pretty big incentives, especially for some of these large-scale manufacturing when it comes to electric vehicles and battery plants, as the shift towards green energy occurs. So, a lot of concern is also there that, this could put not just Michigan, but the country at risk of, potential foreign adversaries taking advantage of that, and then not only using some of these incentives, but also, potentially causing security threats.
Thanks for that, Lauren. And if you want to read more about her work, the link is in the chat. We also had a reader who asked about new rules that allow rides to be offered to Michigan voters to early voting sites and polling places. Lauren, what do we know about these new rules?
Yeah, so this is something that has come up quite a bit during previous election cycles. Companies like Uber and Lyft, or even local churches or other, voter advocacy groups, have offered rides to the polls for people who are not able to get there for whatever reason. If it's, whether, they don't have the transportation, or if it's a transportation issue for older voters. This is something that, is something that has been offered in other states. But for a while in Michigan, there was an old law on the books that essentially prohibited folks from doing that, providing transportation to the polls. In the last session, in the last few months at least, the Democrats have changed that with a slew of election-related process laws as part of implementing some other voter-initiated laws like Proposal 2 and early voting. This was another process area where you're now allowed to offer rides to the polls as long as you're not promoting a specific candidate. So what happens there remains to be seen, whether companies or local churches or other groups take advantage of this. Kind of remains to be seen. Probably a little closer to Election Day, we'll know more.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Well, we appreciate you all being here today about talking about the election, asking your questions. If you have any last questions about the election, we can answer those right now. And then, Simon, I've got one other follow-up for you going back to this, just going on the U of M of Regent stuff. I misspoke earlier saying you were at the Democratic Convention. You were actually at the Republican State Convention. There was a little bit, there was conflict related to the three candidates running for the U of M Board of Regents spots. The person that did not get on the ballot, she supports the University of Michigan divesting from Israel. Can you talk a little bit about what that race was like?
Yeah, so although Jordan Acker was not on the ballot and confronted by protesters, this also seeped into the actual 2 seats that were available. And so the third person in this race was Hawat Araf, and she's a Palestinian American activist who was active in the uncommitted movement leading up to the presidential primary, served as an alternate delegate, as a representative of those votes, which was about, I think, 13%, but they got about 100,000 votes in the presidential primary. And she came in third. She was about 100 votes behind Illich and about 500 votes behind Shauna Ryder-Diggs. And this caused a lot of controversy and acrimony within the convention. Protesters chanted their opposition to the results. They seemed a little skeptical of these results. But I think it also speaks to the fact that her inability to win at this convention also speaks to the fact that there's sort of two sides, a war or a tussle, within Democratic politics, that there's a contingent of the Democratic Party that is still very vocally, very directly pro-Israel, and that they're just as present as some of these pro-Palestinian activists are as well, even though their social media presence, their pull with younger voters, a crucial constituency for this presidential election, they may not be as visible. And so it's going to be difficult to see whether these two factions can come together. Hawat Araf did not seem conciliatory or necessarily gracious in this loss, because this is something that is really deeply felt. And they were interested in divestment from the University of Michigan from Israeli investments. And it doesn't seem like that's going anywhere anytime soon.
Right. And as the education reporter, I can say that the students and a lot of community members are still rallying for that at the same time. So we'll continue to watch that. University of Michigan just started classes now, today on Monday, and we're going to continue to monitor that. And one more question. We had a reader who wanted to know Bridge's analysis of Hispanic and Latino voters. Mike, what can you tell us?
Well, they could play a substantial role in Michigan. I mean, they make up over 300,000 of the people who are of voting age in the state. Now, I know, we have a state of over nearly 8 million voting age people, but that's not a small number, especially in a state in 2016 that Trump only won the state by 10,000 votes. In terms of polling, I mean, there's not a lot of data. The polls, when you're doing national polls, only come in and ask 600 people from Michigan questions, and it's just not a big enough number to give perspective. But there are other indications that Trump has done very well. He didn't win Hispanics in 2016 or 2020, but he cut into the margins that Democrats had gotten in previous elections. And there's polling that I've seen that's out there that says that Hispanics are supporting Trump in Arizona. There's another national this is before Biden gets out, that Trump was winning among Hispanics nationally. So they could play a big role. They're not a small population in Michigan. It's over 300,000, at least voting wise. It's 6% of the population, 600,000. So it's something to keep an eye on. And it's also something to look to see if people like Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slotkin, the Walls-Harris campaign Trump fans, if they appeal to this population.
Thank you, Mike. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. We're so grateful that you spent part of your morning with Bridge Elections FAQ, where we answer your questions about the election. We have a couple different ways that you can continue to learn more about the election. We have our website, bridgemi.com, which has our elections tracker. We regularly update that. We talk about the different visits from the Trump-Vance campaign as well as the Harris-Walz campaign. We also have YouTube, which has the full recap of this event. And then we have a Politics Watch newsletter that you can sign up for. It's free. It comes out a couple times a week, and we give you insights into all the different political news, both at the state level, at the federal level, and at the local level. Thank you again for being here today. Thank you, Lauren, Simon, and Mike, for answering questions. We'll be back next week. Thank you.